Hi, I'm Mark, and today I want to talk about another broken Brexit promise. But first, let's look at Brexit claiming victims. Because Great Britain is running out of workers, many supermarket shelves are empty, and British households have lost an average of 1,100 euros since leaving the EU. And it is also becoming more difficult for travelers. An English woman has now missed her vacation flight because her passport did not meet EU rules. Apparently, that's not even an isolated case. But before we get into any further downsides, let's first really talk about the heralded purgatory of EU regulations. It was intended to be one of the few visible benefits of leaving the EU, and we're talking about the retained EU law bill, with which the British government wanted to announce its independence from the Union. The draft law stipulated that all rules and regulations that Britain adopted during its membership would automatically expire or be amended by the end of 2023. Apparently, this great Brexit promise cannot be kept after all. According to information from the Financial Times, the government of Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is preparing to back down. The passage contained in the draft law about the end of the effectiveness of all laws from the period of EU membership on December 31st, 2023, is to be deleted. The bill is currently being discussed in the House of Lords, having passed the House of Commons last year already. According to estimates, this involves a good 4,000 separate laws that London would have to sift through and adapt or scrap without replacement by the end of the year. That's a mammoth task for the administration and a nightmare for British companies, which would face legal uncertainties and new problems in trade with the EU. Economics Minister Kemi Badenoch said that a maximum of 800 laws could be rewritten or overturned by the end of the year. We want to get our law books in shape and not remove rules for the sake of deletion. That is what Badenoch said now. That sounded differently last year. For the project, also known as Bonfire, the government had introduced a bill called the EU Retained Law Bill to Parliament. A clause known as the Sunset Clause provided that laws from the EU era were to become invalid at a stroke by the end of the year if they were not changed or explicitly retained by then. And critics, including numerous trade unions and associations, had warned against this step because it could create legal loopholes, for example, in labor law. A government spokesman said the draft law was still being adhered to in principle and that unnecessary laws were to be abolished. This would allow the country to continue to exploit the opportunities of Brexit and help boost the economy and innovation. But so much for the many famous promises. And to date, by the way, there are no visible benefits for the UK. But let's get back to traveling. EU citizens enjoy numerous benefits, one of which is the freedom of travel within the Union. As of 2020, the UK is no longer a member of the EU, which also has an impact on tourism. A passport has been mandatory for entry into EU countries since October 2021 and must comply with the Brexit rules. And the identity document must therefore not be older than 10 years. However, not everyone is aware of this. According to a report by the British newspaper The Guardian, it is a daily occurrence at British airports that travellers are refused boarding and miss their holiday flight, in most cases because their passport is too old. The British newspaper cites the example of a teacher from Brighton who was in tears after a British airline employee refused her boarding to a flight to Paris. She only checked the expiry date before starting her trip, and her passport was still valid for another 8 months. I had no idea about the 10-year rule, said the teacher, complaining that the general public had little knowledge of the new travel rules. I wasn't the only one this happened to at the airport that day, she said. British passports are said to be valid for 10 years by default, so the problem shouldn't really exist. However, those who renewed their passport before September 2018 could add up to 9 months to the expiry date. There are a few valid passports that are more than 10 years old. But the rules for EU travel by British citizens since Brexit are clear. Entry and exit only with a passport. An ID card alone is not enough anymore, and they don't have them anyway. Passport must not be older than 10 years on the date of entry, and the passport must be valid for at least 3 months on the date of return. The UK government recommends 6 months, by the way. And rules apply to UK citizens traveling to the EU, Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway, Andorra, Monaco, San Marino, Vatican, and Switzerland. And of course, there are also rules for travelers from EU countries entering Great Britain. Anyone entering Great Britain from EU countries also needs a valid passport and, probably from the end of 2024, an electronic entry permit, which is subject to a fee. A visa is not required for a stay of less than 6 months. The passport rules are not only causing trouble for British citizens. German and French tourists don't seem to want the effort either, because Britain has been less popular with them as a travel destination since Brexit. The fact that EU citizens now need a passport to travel to the UK has proved a deterrent, particularly for school groups, because of the additional costs and red tape. That was said by UK Inbound's Joss Croft and told to the British Observer in April. And half of the Germans also not even have a passport. I talked about this earlier. A report by the UK tourism body Visit Britain found that in 2022 about a third fewer visitors came to the UK than in 2019. And ferry operator Brittany Ferries saw an even more drastic drop. Only around 150,000 inboard passengers boarded last year, compared to 338,000 in 2019. And other travel providers are even completely discontinuing their offer in Great Britain. And one of the most famous trains, the Orient Express, will no longer depart from London as a result of Brexit. You might have seen my video on that one too. And one of the reasons was the traffic jams at Dover Ferry Port, which often lasted for hours, which arose due to the additional passport checks that had become necessary since Brexit. The British had obviously imagined Brexit differently. Around 3 years after leaving the EU, more than half, with 57% of people in the UK, are now disappointed with the situation in the UK. This is the result of several surveys at the moment. And only around a quarter continue to be happy with the decision. In the 2016 referendum, a narrow majority of around 52% of those taking part voted to leave the EU. And that is not the majority in the polls at the moment, at least. But Brexit happened, and it will never be done, but Brexit happened, and the people will have to live with that, at least for decades. That is the reality. But people will learn from this, and the other European countries have learned from this, as everybody should learn from history. Talking about history, at the moment, this week, the new Brexit game came, not Brexit game, that's another topic. The new game on Outside Views Games came out, and incidentally, this time it is about European history. So if you're quite fond of history, there's of course also English and a bit of Scottish history in there and so on, but not the most is Europe as a whole. So from many countries, many time frames and so on. And if you want to have some fun and check how much you still know, go to Outside Views Games and play the game. You can play with as many friends as you want, by the way. And maybe you will learn something you have never known before, or you will just refresh what you know, or you're just as brilliant and just dive through the 100 questions like a pro. But you never know before doing it. And there will be another game this month. This is the regular one on the 1st of the month, always on the 1st of the month, comes out in English and in German. And on my English channel, I also have a mid-month game whenever I can do, and this time there will be a mid-month video as well, but that will only be in English because those need a lot of time to make. If you haven't seen them yet, have a look, then you know what I'm talking about. And I'll see you in my next video. I'll be back.